Hey everybody, Greg Pruitt here with Idaho Dispatch, and I'm joined today by Corey DeAngelis. How are you?
Hey, doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. A lot of people may not know who you are, and so I guess real quick, you can briefly just tell a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm Corey DeAngelis. I'm the National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children, a national school choice advocacy group. I've really had my first experience with school choice growing up. I actually attended government-run schools all through K through 12 in San Antonio, Texas. But in high school, I had the opportunity to go to something called a magnet school, which is still a school that's run by the government or run by the school district. But you're not residentially assigned to a magnet school. So they have stronger incentives to cater to the needs of families because they have to entice their customers or families to attend the school. And for the 4 years that I had the high school experience, I was actually on the same campus as the school that I was residentially assigned to attend. And I saw a night and day difference with the educational opportunities at the school that I had. And I feel like that had a positive impact on my life trajectory, and I want more families to have access to educational opportunities, and it shouldn't be limited to a school that's run by the government. There's no reason why the funding shouldn't follow the child to wherever they want to get an education, which could also include another type of public school, but it could also be a private school or some type of home-based learning situation, such as a micro school or a pandemic pod that we saw sprouting up all across the country starting in March of 2020. After high school, I did a bachelor's and master's in economics, where it really opened my mind to the problems with monopolies, which is a huge problem with K through 12 education all across the country. We have these geographically assigned, residentially assigned, government-run monopolies in K through 12 education, which could lead to a weak incentive to cater to the needs of families. After I did my bachelor's and master's in economics, I did a PhD in education policy, where my first study there was of the effects of the Milwaukee voucher program, which has been around for about 3 decades now, and how it had crime reducing effects. So I was able to look up the criminal records of thousands of students using the program compared to their similarly matched peers in nearby public schools, and found statistically significant reductions in crime later on in life when they were about 25 to 30 years of age. Since that study, there's 6 studies now that exist on the topic linking school choice to crime reduction. All 6 of them are peer reviewed. I've done 2 of them, and they've all found statistically significant reductions in criminal
What
activity.
is the? Sorry for interrupting there. What is? I guess what has led to that, or
Yeah.
from the studies, what has led to the reduction in crime by simply having
There's a
that
lot of different
in
theories
place?
for why that could play out, and it could be a different reason for different students, right? But one of the main arguments could be that competition leads to better outcomes with academics, math and reading test scores, but it also leads to stronger incentives to cater to families' needs for other types of quality metrics in the school. One could be values that are instilled in the curriculum. It could be character-based education. It could just be a better fit between the student and the school. And if they're interested in what's going on at school, they're less likely to get involved in these criminal activities. It could be a networking effect. So there's a lot of different theoretical mechanisms for why this could play out. But we have tons of evidence looking at non-test score outcomes associated with school choice leading to benefits. And look, the reality is parents choose schools for a lot of different reasons. And one of those reasons could be academics and standardized test score results, but another reason could be the character-based education and whether the school is a safe environment. What's the mission of the school? Is it meeting the needs of your individual child based on the type of mission that they're interested in? So there's a lot of different reasons for that. And after I did my PhD in education policy, looking at these kind of results, I also have a study linking school choice to improvements in mental health as well, which not a very big leap in logic to understand that if families can send their kid to a school that's more aligned with their values and the kid is happy there, should have a positive effect on their well-being during that entire K through 12 education. But then I started in the think tank world, where I started at the Cato Institute after that, Reason Foundation, and now I'm with the American Federation for Children, fighting for school choice all across the nation. We had the year of school choice in 2021. 19 states expanded or enacted programs to fund students as opposed to systems in 2021, and we're just getting started. There are about 30 states this year in 2022 that have bills in play to allow the funding to follow the child to wherever they're getting an education.
Is Idaho one of those?
Idaho could have been one of the victories last year. There was a bill in play that passed through the House. I believe it was Senator Lori Den Hartog's bill last year. Did not pass through the Senate, however. So 19 other states had victories. Idaho did not have a full victory that got signed into law. And so they kind of missed out on the fun a little bit last year in Idaho. But there could be passage of a bill this year, and I know we'll see what happens.
So what's the simplicity of, because I know I've looked on some of your tweets and you talk a lot about this, money following the students. Can you kind of explain to the average citizen what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, most people think about this in terms of the word school choice. I talk about it in terms of funding the student directly as opposed to the system, having the funding follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. So the simplest way to explain that is we have funding that follows the child to the government-run schools today. Idaho spends about $10,000 per student according to the 2019 Census Bureau data. It's probably higher now after the infusion of federal funding since March of 2020, but about $10,000 per student. These types of programs, the money that would have followed the child to the government-run school, you can still take it there if you want. That option's still on the table. You just keep your kids in the government-run school. But if not, a portion of the funding would follow the child into something called an education savings account, which could then be used on any approved education expenditure. You could use that for private school tuition and fees. You could use it for private tutoring, instructional materials, homeschool curriculum expenses, any approved education expenditure. It's the gold standard of school choice policy. It's the purest form of the idea of funding students as opposed to systems. And we already do this with higher education in a way, in that we have Pell Grants for low-income students. We have the GI Bill for veterans. The money doesn't go straight to a residentially assigned college, regardless of the choice of the student. Instead, the funding goes to the student, and then they can choose the community college, for example, if they want, but they could also choose to take the money to a public university, a private university, religious or non-religious provider. Federal Head Start program for pre-K, we have the same kind of idea where you could choose to send your kid to a religious or non-religious provider of pre-K services. You don't have to send your kid to a residentially assigned government-run provider of pre-K services. Same thing with food stamps. We don't tell low-income families that they must use their food stamp dollars at a residentially assigned government-run provider of grocery services, and I think most people would find that ridiculous. Instead, the money goes to the families, and then they can choose Walmart or Safeway or Trader Joe's, any provider of grocery services. And I'm just arguing we apply the same logic to K-12 education and fund the people as opposed to the buildings.
Okay. So if people are just going to leave their kids in the regular public school that they already go to, how does that impact? Do they still get money regardless, or is it, hey, you're choosing to go to this school, therefore you don't get this?
Oh, then yeah, you're essentially choosing to use your tuition dollars at the public school. Okay. So you don't get paid twice, right? You don't get the $10,000 while staying in the school that's already spending $10,000 a year on you. So that would essentially be paying twice for a student that attends one school, a public school. So essentially, if you want to keep your public school, you can keep your public school, but the money would go to the public school, obviously. Okay. But if you want to switch to another provider, then you can take that money to another provider. And what's interesting is most of these bills, how they work out, it's usually tied to the state portion of total funding. In Idaho, I think that's about $6,000 per student on average. It might be more or less, but it's about that amount. And so mathematically, when you take about $6,000, the public schools get to keep all the local and federal funding. So they actually end up with higher per pupil revenues and expenditures in the public schools by definition. Because if you're only losing some of the money and you're keeping thousands of dollars for students who are no longer there, you must end up with higher per pupil education expenditures and revenues. So that they actually financially benefit in the public school system. And even if you don't use this program, you could also benefit in terms of competition. We have 27 studies on the topic nationwide. I'm not cherry picking. That is just the number of studies that exist on the topic between private school choice competition and what happens in the public school system. 25 of the 27 studies find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the kids' outcomes who remain in the public schools. So this is a rising tide that lifts all boats. It's a win-win solution. And part of that's because of competition. The public schools up their game in response to these pressures, but they also end up with more funding per student, and they have stronger incentives to spend the money wisely if they know that families can vote with their feet with this true form of accountability, which is bottom-up accountability that we have in every other industry. We have with higher education, we have with pre-K, and now this is an introduction to this idea to K through 12 education. And it's not a new idea. Most states have some form of private school choice enacted already. I think 31 states now or more already have something like this. Idaho does not. And we have 10 states that have these education savings account program ideas. And if you look at the 30 states or so that have introduced these bills this year, most of them are education savings accounts. This is the purest form of funding students as opposed to systems.
Okay. What has been the biggest roadblock in states where it's not getting through? I guess in Idaho, in this case, what is the biggest roadblock?
Well, you hear the same tired arguments year after year from the establishment. I mean, it's not about what the parents need. It's not about logic. It's about power. The entrenched special interest fights against any change to the status quo because they want to keep your children's education dollars regardless of how well they do, regardless of the satisfaction levels of the family. And from what we've seen over the past year in some districts, even in places like Idaho, past 2 years, that they want to keep the money regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. So of course they fight as hard as possible against any change to that. They don't want to empower the families to choose because then they would have to face true accountability and competitive pressures, and they'd have to change their way of doing things. But they'll still repeat the same tired argument that this steals money from the public schools. School choice steals money from the public schools, or it defunds public schools is what they'll say. And my response is the money doesn't belong to the government schools in the first place. Education funding is meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution, public or private. The money is meant for educating the child. It can still follow them to the public school if they want, but it shouldn't go straight to the building regardless of the choice of the family. And no one would ever say that allowing families to choose their grocery store stole money from Walmart. Why would no one say that? Because we all understand that even if you're using a taxpayer-funded initiative like a food stamp, the money doesn't belong to any of the institutions. We all understand that the primary beneficiaries of that funding is the family and their children. And the same thing goes for K through 12 education funding. No one would say that Pell Grants steal money from community colleges just because you could use it for a private religious university. No one would say that Medicaid funding steals money from government hospitals just because you could use Medicaid funding at a private religious Catholic affiliated hospital if you want. And so they get the argument completely backwards in that they essentially are implying that they think that your kids' education dollars belong to them, when in reality, this is about the student and it belongs to the family. And then, by the way, if your main argument is that this will defund the public schools, you must ask yourself, like, why do you think that's the case? Why would giving families a choice defund the public schools? They usually can't respond to that question because they're essentially implying that they understand that a lot of families aren't happy with the current system. A lot of families are happy with the current public schools, and nothing would change if the public schools are doing a good job for your kids. But the reality is there's a lot of families that are stuck in a school that might not be working for them, and they're fighting to force families to send their kids into these institutions for 13 years without exit options. And who are the families that are most likely to be adversely affected from the status quo? It's the ones that don't have the means to pay for private school tuition and fees now. So school choice is an equalizer in the sense that the most advantaged already have school choice. They can already afford to live in the neighborhoods that happen to be residentially assigned to the best quote-unquote public schools. They're more likely, at least the most advantaged, to be able to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. Funding the student directly allows more families to access these opportunities. And again, that in that sense, school choice is an equalizer. And then my last response to that argument is something I said earlier. You get to keep thousands of dollars for students who are no longer there. This doesn't defund the public schools. If anything, they end up more well-funded on a per pupil basis. Just mathematically, that's how it ends up. And those are the three responses. The money doesn't belong to you in the first place. It belongs to the students. 2, why would this happen? You are telling on yourself, and this is an argument for school choice, not one against it, because you understand that a lot of families aren't happy. 3, mathematically, the public schools end up with higher per pupil revenues and expenditures. And then fourth response is the public schools get better in response to competition. We have tons of evidence on this. Competition works in higher education and pre-K. It works in every other industry. It works for K-12 education as well. And look, the reality is, for a long time, the only special interest group that politicians actually had to worry about were the special interest in terms of the employee unions, the teachers unions, the superintendents unions, and they had a lot of sway. But since 2020, over the past 2 years, there's a new special interest group in town, which happens to be parents who want more of a say in their kids' education. Remote learning was horrible for a lot of reasons. It hurt kids academically, mentally, physically, socially. It happened in more districts than others and in more states, some more than states than others. But the unintended benefit of this remote learning, which is more like remotely learning because they weren't learning that much, it's more, we should call it remote instruction if anything. But these school closures allowed families to see what was happening in the classroom. And a lot of the families who thought that their kids were in great public schools based on math or reading test scores started to see another dimension of school quality that they didn't really think about as much before, which happened to be the curriculum in the classroom and whether that was aligned with families' values. And so these families have been mobilized to push for change that weren't as mobilized before. And again, we have 19 states with victories in 2021. We're expecting big victories across the country again in 2022. And the reality is a lot of parents across the nation felt powerless in 2020. And they're going to fight to make sure they never feel powerless like that ever again going forward. And politicians from all parties would be wise to listen to this new special interest group, parents, going forward. Because they're more mobilized than they've ever been before. They're watching, and they want more of a say in their kids' education. And the best way to empower parents is to have the money follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. That is the strongest, if not the only form of accountability, being able to vote with your feet to another institution if the residentially assigned option doesn't work. Again, you can still pick that, and you should absolutely have that option on the table. But if they don't listen to you at the school board meetings, if they don't change how they operate, you should be able to take your kids' education dollars to another provider of the service. And that's another thing that kind of unfurled over the past year, is that we saw that a lot of the pushback at the school boards doesn't lead to the intended result on the part of the parents. We had the National School Boards Association colluding with the Biden administration, in which they sent a letter to the Biden administration essentially implying that some parents, or suggesting that some parents be investigated as domestic terrorists for pushing back at school board meetings because they weren't happy with the curriculum that they saw over the past couple of years in the classroom. Well, since that happened, 19 states have pulled their membership of their funding from the National School Boards Association. Idaho wasn't one of those states, even though legislators sent a letter to the Idaho School Boards Association asking them to end their membership immediately. But now, with these 19 other states that have made movement on this within just the last couple of months, we might as well call that organization the Regional School Boards Association, because they've essentially imploded, and it's all their own fault, and that they let the mask slip in with this letter essentially having an anti-parent stance. And I'll also go further to say that I think this momentum is going to continue going forward, because even if the establishment does try its best for parents, which they're not doing right now, but let's just imagine they changed their tune, the problem is with the system itself. It's a one-size-fits-all disaster in too many cases, that it's just not going to work for every single individual family, even if it works for the majority of families. Parents differ on how they want their kids raised and educated, and that's okay. I mean, think about all the battles we've seen pop up over the past 2 years. Should we have remote or in-person instruction? Should we have this curriculum or that curriculum? Should we have this masking procedure in all the schools, or should we have parents choose? Should we have this COVID mitigation strategy or this COVID mitigation strategy? All of these battles that have bubbled up over the past 2 years are just symptoms of the larger problem, which happens to be that we force thousands and thousands of families to send their kids to a one-size-fits-all government-run school system. That's not because the people in the system are bad. I think most teachers are doing the best that they can in public and private schools. They're doing what they can for kids. The problem is with the system itself. They're stuck in this one-size-fits-all situation that by definition is not going to work for every single family. So the only way forward through freedom rather than force is to allow the money to follow the child so that parents can send their kids to institutions that truly align with their values. I don't care what type of curriculum is taught in these schools. I just want families to have a choice. If it's more of a social emotional learning in a private school, that's a-okay with me. But what the problem with the current system is that we have parents that are stuck in the system sending their kids to schools where they feel like they're being indoctrinated for 13 years. Some parents might like the current curriculum in the public schools, and they should be able to have that option. The problem arises when parents are forced into this system. So we should just allow everyone to choose so that we don't have to force our values on other people's kids.
So you're talking about this system, and obviously the education system is one of the biggest in the entire country, and it's not even close. So it almost seems like you're saying, like, if we're able to do this, let's say in all 50 states, does the system either correct, collapse, or what comes out of that, or what's next after that? So let's say your group is successful and maybe 40 states get this money follows the students. Does that fix it, or does it fix it halfway, or what are your thoughts, or what would be the next step if you were able to do that in most of the states?
Well, we have had a lot of victories over the past year, but we have a long way to go to empower every single family with the choice to send their kids to the school that works best for them. We have West Virginia as a big example of success last year. They didn't have any charter schools in 2020. They didn't have any private school choice initiatives where the money followed the child. And they just passed in 2020 the most expansive education savings account program in the nation. Regardless of income, you can take your children's state-funded education dollars to the education provider of their choosing. So that's a job well done, but there's so many other states where we have a long way to go, including Idaho. And so we're going to be fighting this for a long time, and I don't think the system would collapse. We have tons of evidence on this topic. Again, 25 of 27 studies find that the public schools get better as well. I don't want this to destroy the system. I want the system to improve. And this is one way to make the system improve because they up their game in response to competition. Think about Florida. Florida has one of the most expansive school choice environments in the nation. And their public schools on the NAEP, the nation's report card, was about middle of the pack a couple of decades ago. But according to the latest results in 2019 that were released, Florida is at the top of the nation in the top 5, depending on the outcome, whether it's math or reading or it's this grade versus that grade. But they've improved in the rankings a lot after adjusting for student demographic characteristics. And they've also improved the amount of school choice in the state as well, and empowering more parents. So this type of bottom-up accountability has worked for the public schools too, and it has been a rising tide that lifts all boats. We have 11 studies from Florida. 10 of 11 studies from Florida find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the kids' outcomes in the public schools too. And there's another kind of aspect of this as well in relation to public school teachers. Public school teachers would benefit from this as well because there's 5 studies that I've seen on the topic. I wrote about this in an article at the Washington Examiner called School Choice Benefits Teachers Too. All 5 studies that I've seen on the topic find statistically significant positive effects of either charter or private school choice competition on the public school teacher salaries in the public school system. Why does this happen? Because their employer, which is currently a monopoly, starts to think a little bit more about how they allocate resources, and they start to put more money into the classroom, and they start to allocate it more towards individual teachers instead of administrative bloat and staffing surges. What we've seen with the staffing surges all across the country has just been ridiculous nationwide. Ben Scafferty, for example, looked at data all across the country between 1992 and 2014 in a report called Back to the Staffing Surge. And he found that per pupil education expenditures nationwide increased over that period by about 27% in real terms, but teacher salaries actually dropped by 2% over that same period. So when teachers are complaining about having to pay out of pocket for their supplies each year, I kind of feel bad for them. But the problem isn't with their competition. The problem is with their employer, which happens to be a massive geographic monopoly that doesn't have any particularly strong incentives to spend money wisely. And the best way to spend that money wisely in the current system is to allocate it towards the classroom so that it goes towards student learning. And the most important educational resource we have in the current system happens to be teachers who are trying to do the best they can for students. So we've seen that competition could help the teachers in the current system as well. The problem is with the teachers' unions that have a totally different incentive structure. If you're a union boss like Randy Weingarten, who makes over $560,000 at the American Federation of Teachers, your incentive is to put more people into the system because that means more dues-paying members. And this is what Ben Scafferty found in his report. Enrollment of students increased by a very small amount, but staffing surges were just through the roof. And we're seeing this across the nation with 2022 education budgets as well. In Los Angeles, just because it's at the top of my head, for example, I looked into their budget, and they plan to increase per pupil expenditures over the past couple of years in 2022 by about 69%. Huge infusion of federal money. I don't know what the numbers are for Idaho, but they've received a bunch of money as well in Idaho. But district officials in Los Angeles public schools reported that, one, they're losing 6% of their school-aged population enrollment in the public school system, but they're planning to increase the number of teachers in the system by 8%, the number of custodial workers in the system by 25%, and the number of social workers in the system by about 80%. In what other industry do you lose 6% of your customer base and you start hiring a bunch of more people? Why do they do that? Because that means more dues-paying members. Which is great for union bosses like Randy Weingarten. But if you're spending the money on hiring more people, that means less money for the people that are currently in the system doing a good job. So I think competition would help teachers as well. And the reason for this is because competition in the market for goods and services is obviously great for families and their students and customers. But competition in the labor market is good for employees at the same time. So this would be a win-win situation again. Teachers could benefit and families.
Okay. I did want to go back a little bit and just pop back into my head because Idaho is unique with our education system in that we are one of very few states that does not have almost any homeschooling regulations. I think Oklahoma, Idaho, and maybe a couple others. So there's no designed curriculum. You can literally do whatever you want with your kids. A lot of people, especially in the homeschooling community, love that aspect. What if one of their concerns is that, yes, they want that money to be able to teach their kids, but is the government all of a sudden going to come in and say, okay, well, but now we're not going to let you just have that money to do whatever you want. Now we need to get some homeschooling regulations in to make sure you're homeschooling your kids properly.
Yeah, so it depends on the bill, but I will say education savings accounts tend to be the least likely regulated as opposed to vouchers or these scholarship programs. And that's just what we've seen across the nation with the existing education savings account program. So these families should look at the language in the bill and see what types of regulations are attached. But at the same time, each individual family can make that decision for their own kids. They can weigh the potential costs of regulations with the benefits in terms of funding for homeschooling curriculum and other services for homeschooling families. And they should be able to make that cost-benefit decision themselves. And since it's all voluntary, this is a step in the right direction. But at the same time, they shouldn't tell other families that if they can't afford the costs associated with home-based education, that other families shouldn't be able to make that decision. And what's good about most of the bills that I've seen is that you can define an ESA student as separately from a homeschooling student on the books. So even if it looks like you're doing homeschooling things, in the law you'll be defined as an education savings account student. You're not a homeschooling student. Whereas the pure homeschoolers that don't accept any funding at all would be protected from the future regulations because of this separation. So that reduces the likelihood of this being a real concern. And I think, look, the best argument in support of this as being a step in the right direction is is that the status quo is already highly regulated by the government, and families have the choice each and every year to choose to accept that funding or not. So the voluntary aspect, I think, is a positive for me, and I think it would be a positive for a lot of homeschoolers to know that they don't have to accept the money. And then at the same time, look, the government, if it wants to regulate homeschoolers, they're going to do it regardless of whether funding follows the child or not. So if you can make homeschooling more mainstream by having more people have the option to do home-based education, you build a bigger tent to fight against regulations that could come in the future from others in society. And in fact, that's another benefit of the COVID school closures, is that even though it was kind of like this government schooling at home, I wouldn't really call it pure homeschooling in a lot of the sense, but also families have switched in record numbers to pure homeschooling, not being enrolled in a public school or a private school, and just they figured out that they can do it at home. They built their confidence and started to see that their kids were less anxious, learning more at a fraction of the time. And so a lot of families have made the switch. According to Census Bureau data from the American Pulse Survey, I think the homeschooling numbers have at least doubled since pre-pandemic levels. And if you look at polling done by Morning Consult each and every month since April of 2020, society is generally more likely to say that they are more favorable of homeschooling now than they are to say that they're less favorable of homeschooling relative to pre-pandemic. And I think that's because more people got a taste of home-based education, and it's a more mainstream concept now, which will decrease the likelihood of regulation in the future, or at least calls for these regulations. So look, it's voluntary. You make it more mainstream, you get more people to fight against regulations and reduce the likelihood that people call for these regulations. And let's not make perfect the enemy of the good, because the status quo is highly regulated already. And look, if you don't want to take the money, you don't have to take the money. You shouldn't be forced to take the money. But at the same time, you shouldn't tell other parents that they can't make that decision for their kids as well. So I think this is a step in the right direction for all families, including homeschoolers. And yeah, those are, I think, the basics of my response to that question. And I already mentioned this, but homeschoolers and ESA students would be separated in the law, which should alleviate concerns about future regulations as well.
Okay. All right. Well, anything else? What do parents need to do if they want to get involved with your organization, or do you guys not? Or is it more of like, hey, just kind of follow us and see if we're in your state, or how do they get involved?
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously follow me on Twitter. I'll announce any movement in the legislature here in Idaho on my Twitter, which is at DeAngelis Corey, which is my last name and my first name. You can also sign a pledge to support education freedom, and you can do that online. It's educationfreedompledge.com, and then I can give you updates through that as well if you want to sign up. Again, educationfreedompledge.com. And then also you can look for updates at the Idaho Freedom Foundation Facebook page if you'd like, or their website, idahofreedom.org.
Okay. All right, sir. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking with me. It was good to meet you.